We're going to attempt today to do a virtual video that we normally do with the Envirothon out in the field. And Josh Elliott, who works with NRCS, he's going to do part of it. And I worked with NRCS for a while, and I'm going to do part of it. And I know it's going to be a little different, be a lot different, because y'all will be looking at it in your classroom at the school where you go to school at, as far as what we're saying here today. And we're going to try to cover basically the things we would cover out in the field, but it's going to be just through this video. And like I said, we're going to just flip-flop back and forth, Josh and I will, and we'll just talk about some things that you need to remember that will be on the written portion of the test. And a lot of y'all have already been through the Envirothon, and you kind of know what to expect and this kind of stuff. But it's gonna be like, you know, everything has changed over this last year, big time. So let's get started with it. And I'm gonna start and explain a soil profile to start with. And if we were outside, we would see a bank that had been shaved off, or dig a hole, and it needs to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 to 50 inches deep, or so, that you can see the profile, because that's about the depth you would need to have a good looking profile. Always remember that this is a profile. These lines across here, this is different colored soils as you go down through there, and you start out with an O horizon. Now an O horizon, you don't always have one, because the O horizon is going to be decayed matter, like in a forest or something like that, where you got leaves on the ground, and you would have an O horizon. But if you were out in a cropland field, you may not have an O horizon. You having more O horizons in cropland now since we went to no-till and this kind of stuff. Where used to, when they used a moldboard plow and just turned it over, you just definitely did not have an O horizon. But remember, the O is the top layer up here. You can have one or not have one. Then you got an A horizon and a B horizon and a C horizon. Okay, the A horizon is basically your topsoil. That's where you plant seeds into. That it's your better soil as far as getting plants to come up and grow and start in that A horizon. Okay, then you go from an A horizon. Now the A horizon is not going to be usually but 6 or 8 inches or something like that. That's really good topsoil if you got it that much. You may not have but 3 inches or 2 inches, or it's according to how much it's been eroded away and this kind of stuff. All right, let's go on to the B horizon. The B horizon is below the A, and roots can still go down into the B, but usually you got more clay in the B horizon, a lot more than you would in the A horizon. All right, once you leave the B horizon, you go down to the C horizon, and when you get down there, you're 48 inches or so deep, and you may hit bedrock. It's a lot of rock. This is where all the soil came from, is down here eventually. It made its way up to being an A or a B. But this is what we call the parent material down here, as far as getting into the bedrock. So remember, you got O, A, B, and C horizons. You can't always have an O, but you're going to always have an A unless it's really eroded real bad. And then you're going to have a B, and then you're going to have a C. And what I was wanting to do is, I've got a picture right here that I know it's small, but Maybe it can show the O and the A and the B and the C better than I drawed it right there. Okay, all the soil, regardless of where they are, is made up of sand, silt, or clay. And they can be different amounts of clay in there, or different amounts of silt, or different amounts of sand. And I always tell the group when we together, which one would hold the most water? Would it be sand or would it be the clay? And usually everybody says sand, because you go to the beach and if you dig a hole out and you go over and take you a quart jar or something and go out there and get your water from the ocean and pour it back in that hole, and time you go back and fill it up and then come back again, it's all gone. Then you pour it back in there and you go back, it just goes straight through it. You say it would hold more than clay, but that's not true. The clay soil holds more water than sand does, and that's the reason it can have better moisture for the plants that are being grown, because it can hold the moisture longer than the sand can. And we're going to talk about sand, silt, and clay a little bit more in just a few minutes. We're going to skip around on this, and Josh, you want to talk about?
So like Mr. Joe mentioned, we work for NRCS, which stands for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Our agency was started in the 30s, and initially it was started to help row crop farmers address erosion problems on cropland. So that's still kind of what we do mostly. That's still our bread and butter, but we do a lot of other things as well. But one of the most important things when you talk about soil is you have to talk about conserving the soil. And so conserving doesn't mean that you're not going to use it. It's not like you're going to set it aside and protect it, and you can't touch it or use it or anything like that, because soil is very important and we have to use it. Of course, our food is grown out of the soil. Our clothes, cotton that we wear, trees obviously grow in the soil, and so there's our your money, your wood for houses. So anyway, soil is important. We have to use it, but it's also important that we protect it so that we'll be able to keep on using it. So some of the ways that we conserve soil are by implementing conservation practices. And that's what our agency does. We teach landowners about conservation practices. And then we also sometimes have cost share monies that we can get to where we say, if you do this to help protect the land, we'll pay for 80% of it, or something like that. So when you're talking about different conservation practices, some of the most obvious ones that come to mind are terraces. Many of y'all are familiar with those when you're riding down the road and you look over a field and you see the little ridges in the field. We call those terraces, and that just breaks up the water as it's flowing over the field to keep the soil from eroding. That's a very common conservation practice. Another very common conservation practice are planting cover crops. When you don't have a crop actively growing, say in the winter, for example, if you come and plant rye or wheat or oats, just something to keep a green cover on the field at all times. As you can imagine, if there was nothing but bare soil there and came a big thunderstorm, when the rain hits the soil, it's like miniature bombs almost exploding on the soil if you were to look at it through a microscope. So then you get enough rain and it washes all that topsoil away, and it's not going to be very, very productive. So it's important that we implement these conservation practices to keep the soil productive. So again, one of those cover crops. We talked about the terraces. Some of the other ones, say cover crops, any permanent vegetation on a field. So for example, if you were to cut the timber on a place, it would be important to come back and replant something, you know, whether it's trees or if you establish some permanent grass or something like that. So not only do conservation practices help conserve the soil, but they also can improve the soil. And so when you talk about improving soil, you talk about terms like soil tilth, which is how easy the soil is worked. You talk about soil structure. All of these key indicators to talk about how healthy a soil is, because soil is really a living organism. So you have different other living organisms in the soil. They're indicators like insects, earthworms are a big one. So if you go around and dig out in the soil and you find other living things, then that's a pretty good indicator that you have good soil quality or healthy soil.
As far as these different layers, you're going to have different soils. They're going to have different names, and a soil scientist has determined what the name would be based on what is in adjoining counties and that kind of stuff as far as giving it a name. But remember that sand, silt, and clay is still going to be in every soil, and that's the major three things that's going to make up that soil. But like you can have a different name for all the soils. All right, but Alabama has got a state soil, and I always ask everybody if you know what it is, but I'm going to say this one time. The name of it is a Bama soil. That's the state soil for Alabama. And that's the last time I'm going to say that word, because I'm an Auburn graduate. But anyway, the way the soil scientist determines these names and so forth, they have a Munsell color book, and if I had one, I could show you what they look at in relationship to the different colors, and they match it out. It's just like a puzzle, putting it together, and the colors make help them to know what to map that soil as. And now remember this, all soils in Alabama by county, you can go online and pull up where you live at, any place you want, and you can see what the soil types are. The whole county has been mapped, every county in Alabama. And if you go to your NRCS office, you can get a book if you wanted one. This is one right here of St. Clair County, and it's been done. It'll tell you what year it was done inside the book and everything if you wanted a copy of it. But most people now just get online because it's so much easier to just get on there and see where they want to go, and they can see the soils, and the soil types will tell you if it's suited for cropland, if it's suited for pasture land, it's better for this crop and so forth. A lot of information in here, online as well as in this book right here. It's fairly thick, but it's got all the information there that you would want to know about a particular soil. And like I said, the soil scientists use a Munsell color book, is the name of the book that they use to just determine the color of the soil, to help them determine what the name will be. One thing that has a lot to do with color is wetland soils. We call them a hydric soil. And if you have a gray or almost a black in some instances, within the top 10 inches, you're going to probably have a wetland soil. It's going to be a hydric soil. It could be very wet too. You see gray models in this A area right in through here. It's going to be a lowland where they, they wet, only way to put it. And the thing about it is, wetland soils what would you think about a drainage on a wetland soil? It's gonna be not too good, because it's standing water, or the water is in this area right here, is the reason it's got those gray mottles in it and so forth.
How does permeability relate to wetland soils?
Permeability would be very slow on wetland soil, because it stays wet, and we're talking about like on sand, permeability on sand. If you're going down to the beach, it's going to be rapid. It's going, like I said earlier, water just goes so fast through it. But if you got a wetland soil, it's going to definitely be slow, and that would dictate what you could use it for, and a lot of different things. Now, all soils have what they call a water holding capacity, and that again is like we talked about earlier. You got real sandy soils, it's not going to hold the water as good as a clay soil. Now, you can get too much clay in there, but if you got a little clay in there to hold that moisture in, you're going to have a lot better growing for you, whatever you got planted out there. The color that we talked about on that Munsell color chart that a soil scientist uses, that's one of the things that you can actually see better than you can on, feeling of the texture of the soil. If it's gritty, it's going to be sand. If it feels like flour, you go and get you a little flour and put between your fingers, and going to feel almost like silk, and that's going to be a not sand, and it's going to have a kind of like your face powder that people don't use that anymore much, but anyway, it's going to feel very slick. The amount of clay that you got in this B horizon right here, if you want to know, you get it kind of wet, and it's going to feel sticky. It's not going to feel gritty and all that kind of stuff like the sand would be. And Josh had already talked about the soil tilth. That's just the ease of working the soil for whatever you got planted or want to plant. And we talked about the different horizons. And remember, this is the bedrock, the last part down here. One thing we do need to mention is, how long does it take to make 1 inch of topsoil up here? It takes 1,000 years to make 1 inch of topsoil. That's a long time.
So going back to the erosion, so some other negative aspects of erosion, obviously losing topsoil, but some of the other bad things that could happen when you have erosion occur are that you lose nutrients, pesticides. It could cause some pollution, washing pesticides off the field, whatever fertilizer you've applied, and it's going to, overall bring down the soil quality of the place. So talking about fertilizer, talking about pesticides, all these are not bad things. They're only bad if you use them improperly or not as the label recommends. But I know many of you are probably familiar with the term pH. So the most prime pH, where plant nutrients are going to be most available, or macronutrients are going to be most available, is between 5.5 and 6.5. Many of you guys have seen the numbers on a fertilizer bag. N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and it gives you different numbers, which are the percentage of each of those that are actually in that fertilizer. And there's numerous blends of fertilizer. You can buy fertilizer these days that have herbicides, pesticides mixed in with them. So it's just important whenever folks are using those type things that you're reading the label and using it as directed.
We talked about the soil taking 1,000 years to make 1 inch of topsoil. You've got to have several things to consider making when it makes that 1 inch. In other words, the parent material, here it is. That's the parent material down here. It's bedrock, but this can actually move up in 1,000 years and give you 1 inch of topsoil. If you do all the practices Josh has been talking about and take care of the soil, then you can make more soil. That's why we don't want erosion taking place. But what you have to have to make that soil is parent material down here at the bottom. The climate's got to be there. The living organisms that's in the soil, topography, and time. And the time is that 1,000 years roughly to make 1 inch of soil. You do have chemical reactions in this soil when it's in the process of making you more soil. We talked about the water holding capacity, and that just is the amount of water that a particular soil can hold that the plants can uptake or use. And like I said, sandy soils do not have as good a water holding capacity as soils with the clay in it. We talked about, we hadn't talked about any maps. In each one of these books, or if you get online, you're gonna see stuff like this right here. When you get online, and you can see the soils, they got little, some of them have numbers in them, some of them gonna have like a DOA or DAB, or some of them got letters in it, but you got a key to it that it'll tell you the name of the soils, whether you online or actually looking at one of these books right here. These are called soil maps, and then it's actually going to have, you actually can see the roads on it. You can a topo map. This is a picture of a topo map, and it's got contour lines on it, kind of like a soil book does, but any place you see that the lines are real close together on a topo map, that means that it's steeper. If they're farther apart, then it's flatter. But topo maps, and then you got soil maps.
So when you talk about maps, especially soils maps or topo maps, as Mr. Joe said, a lot of times those lines are determined by the slope. So the particular slope of a land, so you know how steep or flat it is, has a lot to do with the soil and the physical properties of the soil. So an important thing that we have in Alabama are land, or everywhere in the United States, are land capability classes. And we have 8 in Alabama, and so land, depending on the soil type and the slope of the soil, the slope of the land, it's going to have a capability, it's going to be assigned a capability class. How you determine slope? Slope is defined, or percent slope is defined by how many foot of fall you have in 100 foot. So if you have a hill here, and if you were to take a rod and survey, and you get a 10 here, and you get an 8 here, it's a difference of 2. So that would be 2% slope on that hill. So like I said, that determines a lot of these boundaries on maps that we've been talking about.
If someone was to stick up flags and it was in 50 feet, you have to double it. Because like I said, like Josh said, it's 100 foot. It's the amount of fall that you would have in that 100 foot is going to be the slope on that particular area that you're looking at. In Alabama, we have, and I guess in other states too, you got 8 classes of land. They go from class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And slope is usually the biggest factor that puts it in that class. Now, a class 1 land, I think there's a little over 7 million acres in Alabama that are class 1 land, and that's fairly flat. That's 0 to 2% slope, and 2 feet and 100 feet, it don't look like much. And then you got 2 to 5 and 5 to 8, and you go on down to class, it puts it in class 1, 2, 3, and 4. Usually cropland is going to be no more than class 4 land. Wetland can make it a class in its own, and I always say that class 8, a good example, if anybody's ever been to Stone Mountain, Georgia, and see the rock mountain over there that they show lights on and all that kind of stuff, that's class land. That's class 8 land. It's steep enough and hard enough rock and everything you can rappel off of it, but it's not good for anything growing, basically. But you can have it, like I said, the sandy part, I put it in a class, and you just have to, in every soil, it'll tell you all that information when you look it up, like on a computer or something, and a certain name of a soil, it'll tell you what it's suited for, as well as the slope and, you know, the area that you're looking at. Josh talked about erosion a little bit earlier. Now you got, I think he may have mentioned this, you got, in Alabama you got mainly 2 types of erosion. Water erosion, that's when it rains hard and water runs off, and all of you seen the soil, it gets into the water and it's muddy looking, and so that's water erosion. And then we have a little wind erosion, and that's when it's dry and dusty and the wind blowing hard, and you just see it. And that's the 2 main types that we have in Alabama. Now, in Alabama, getting back to types of soil again, we have several types. Back when I was in school, I think there was 8. It seemed like they added another one. I think there may be 9 now that they have, but most of the soil in Alabama is a ultrasol, or we have a little histosols, but we got what goes through the middle of Alabama all the way from the Mississippi line over to the Georgia line, just below Montgomery. If you can draw a line straight across there, that's black belt soils. And they're not everywhere, but especially over in the western counties, Selma, and through there you got vertisols, and so that's just vertical mixing. And then you go out west, you got aridosols, that's arid soils out in Arizona and so forth. But that's different parts of the country, and it might take a little bit longer for some of those soils to make that 1 inch that we talked about earlier. Like I said, the thing to remember is wind and water is the 2 main sources that we have as far as erosion, causing erosion. And Josh mentioned some of the practices earlier that you can put in to control erosion, and, you know, planting trees to control erosion. Putting in the terraces he talked about would control erosion. But anything that will break up the wind, or that will break up that raindrop when it hits something, it don't need to be hitting on bare soil and then it just pick up that soil and then it's washed away. Everybody eventually have a lawn or something that they want to fertilize and all this kind of stuff, but you can get a soil test done and you can send it to Auburn University or Waters Lab. They got one that it can be sent in Alabama, and they will tell you, based on what you want to plant, of how much fertilizer you need to put on it based on the crop you're going to be planting.